this video is going to be great. And that's said in future tense. And it can stay future tense if you all just commit to watching this video over and over and over again. There's really no need to mess around with past or present tense, even though that's what this video is about. Alright, let's talk about tenses. Past, present, and future.
I'm so tense!
So, what are tenses? They're used to describe if your story is written in past, present, or future tense. Think, I'm going to write, future tense. I wrote, past tense. And I'm writing, present tense. And deciding what tense you want to use in your story can drastically change it. It can affect what you're able to show in the story while keeping it consistent, what information you can give your readers versus characters, and how the reader will be immersed in the story. I really like stories written in first-person past tense because when they get to high-stakes moments, I don't have to worry as much if they're going to die because they couldn't have gone back to write this later if they died. But a lot of people won't like that, and they'll find that break in immersion off-putting. That's not to say you can't write a book in past tense without immersion. You just have to write it different than you would for a book written in present tense. Now, let's start with basics and actually talk about what past, present, and future tenses are.
It's in the past.
Past tense is talking about an event that's already happened. And there are several different ways to do this, like in A Natural History of Dragons by Marie Brennan. The framing device is that it's a memoir, and there are points when the narrator breaks the story to remind us that she is recounting things that have already happened, and that she has a current timeline she's living in. There's actually a point in one of the books where she stops to remind the reader she is not writing her memoirs from beyond the grave. But in Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Riggs, the story is written in past tense, but the narrator never stops to acknowledge whatever present tense he's in as he's recounting the story. And that helps with the suspense. We're never let in on an event until the protagonist becomes aware of it in the story. Both of these are amazing and fun, immersive stories, but they handle the past tense very differently.
It's in the past.
Present tense is talking about events as they're happening. It's not possible for the narrator to jump in and tell us something they learned later on, because that later on hasn't happened yet. We're experiencing the story as it happens with them. But there are still plenty of ways to have dramatic irony in your story. If the book is written from multiple points of view, you can have some characters who know some stuff and others who don't. And present tense is also super fun for writing suspense. We don't know if the character is going to die or what's going to happen next because the narrator doesn't know. A book that does this just beautifully is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. During a lot of the story, the protagonist doesn't know how he got in space or a lot of what's happening. And that leads to amazing suspense, and it makes it so satisfying when the flashbacks happen and we learn how the protagonist got where he is and what's going on with him. And it made it so much more gut-wrenching when we realize Rocky's ship is having issues. That scene almost put Project Hail Mary on the did not finish because it made me sad list. I'm glad I had a friend yelling at me to keep finishing the book, otherwise I wouldn't have.
The end.
Future tense is describing events that are going to happen, and I'm honestly having trouble coming up with books I've read that were written in future tense, and that's probably because it's so hard. It's one thing to have the odd scene that describes something someone's planning on doing, but it's different and so much more difficult to have your whole story describing events that will happen. It can break immersion and make suspense harder because it will feel more theoretical. We spend a lot of our lives worrying about things that might go wrong and talking ourselves down from that anxiety. So to have a story describing things that will definitely happen also means fighting this way of thinking or talking ourselves out of worrying about them. But if you get it right, it can make the story so memorable and make the suspense so much more impactful. Plus, writing in future tense will make sci-fi stories with time shenanigans so much more fun. I haven't read The Ministry of Time yet, but it's on my TBR after it kept popping up when I was doing research for this video.
I've been doing some research.
Alright, so that's past, present, and future tense. And that's also only part of the video, because each of those 3 categories have several more subcategories. When you're writing tenses, you're either going to be writing them in simple, progressive, perfect, or perfect progressive. Simple tenses are describing an event as it happens completely. I read, I read, I will read. Progressive tenses are describing events as they're progressing. I was reading, I am reading, I will be reading. Perfect tenses describe events and how they're surrounded by other events. I had read to chapter 6. I will read up to chapter 6. I am reading up to chapter 6. Perfect progressive is describing events as they're progressing up to another event. I was reading until I reached chapter 6. I'm reading up to chapter 6. I'm going to read up to chapter 6.
New chapter, new chapter.
Basically, all of these are used to describe the way you will end your verb, if you're going to end it in an ed or an ing. And they're all used to answer questions. What did you do? I read. Versus, what were you doing? I was reading. 2 questions that can have vastly different tones and could evoke vastly different answers. Now, you could answer both questions, what did you do, what were you doing, with I read, but that can come across as clunky, and it will also get boring for your readers if you stick to one type of tense through your whole book. Breaking it up can be tricky, but it will keep the story engaging and keep it from sounding flat.
I need a break.
And as for past, present, and future tense, the important thing is to be consistent, because more than likely you will have times when you're switching up tenses in your story. If a character is describing something that happened in their backstory, they'll use past tense even if the story is narrated in future tense. But you need to know where to start and stop using past tense and how to make the transition smooth, because if you don't, it will break immersion and confuse the readers. This is why knowing the different types of tenses is important, so you can pay attention to how your verbs are being formatted and remind yourself, hey, this is a present tense book, but I slipped into past tense when I didn't mean to. This is hopefully something that you'll be able to pick up on in rereading. But it's also why hiring editors and beta readers is so important. Because when you're writing a story, you're standing with your nose pressed up against the glass. And it's so hard to get proper perspective on what you screwed up in it. But other people will be able to see those things and point them out to you. And the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. Just remember to keep writing and keep reading.